Commander Vexhai had fought on 17 different worlds. He had seen species that could tear through steel with their bare claws, witnessed warriors who could survive in the vacuum of space for hours, and faced enemies whose technology could level mountains. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he encountered on that small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. When he returned to the Zephyrian High Command with his warning, they laughed. Not the polite chuckle of diplomatic dismissal, but the genuine, belly-deep laughter of beings who thought they had heard the most ridiculous joke in galactic history. Humans? Admiral Crexton had wheezed between fits of mirth. Those soft, pink bipeds? The ones without natural weapons, armor, or enhanced reflexes? The species that dies if their atmosphere changes by a few percentage points? Vexhai's scarred face had remained stone-cold serious. Admiral, with respect, you don't understand what I witnessed down there. These creatures, they don't fight like any species we've catalogued. They don't follow the basic rules of survival. Commander, the Admiral had replied, wiping tears from his compound eyes, you're a war hero. Perhaps you need some rest. Reassignment to a peaceful sector might. They threw themselves into plasma fire to save strangers, Vexhai had interrupted, his voice growing harder. They continued fighting with mortal wounds that should have incapacitated them. One of their soldiers held a position against my entire squad for 6 hours with a broken spine. 6 hours, Admiral. And, when we finally reached him, he was still trying to reload his primitive projectile weapon. The laughter had died in the briefing room, but the dismissive smirks remained. Submit your report, Commander. We'll take it under advisement. That was 3 cycles ago. Today, as emergency klaxons wailed throughout the Zephyrian home fleet and reports flooded in of impossible human victories across 12 star systems, Admiral Crexton wasn't laughing anymore. The humans were coming. And the galaxy was about to learn why sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that refuses to know when it's beaten. The vast chamber of the Zephyrian High Command buzzed with the confident energy of a species that had ruled the galaxy for over 2,000 cycles. Crystal formations jutted from the walls, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the mood of the assembled officers. Today, those patterns showed the bright blues and golds of victory and expansion. Commander Vexhai stood at attention before the curved amphitheater, his battle-worn armor still bearing scorch marks from his recent deployment. Around him, dozens of high-ranking officials from across the Zephyrian Empire lounged in their organic seating pods, their elongated forms draped in the flowing robes that marked their status. The air shimmered with translated conversations as representatives from conquered worlds added their voices to the chorus of imperial confidence. Admiral Crexton, resplendent in his ceremonial carapace that shifted colors with each breath, gestured for silence. The room's acoustic dampeners activated, creating a bubble of perfect quiet around the central speaking area. Commander Vexhai, the Admiral's voice carried the authority of someone who had never lost a campaign. Your preliminary report on the Sol System reconnaissance mentions some unusual observations. Please elaborate for the benefit of the Council. Vexhai's mandibles clicked once, a nervous habit he had developed during his centuries of service. He had rehearsed this moment during the long journey back to the capital, but, standing before the assembled might of the Empire still made his chitin crawl. Honored Council, he began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to share. The species designation human requires immediate reclassification from Category 7 to Category 1 threat level. A ripple of amusement passed through the chamber. Category 7 was reserved for primitive species barely capable of interplanetary travel. Category 1 was for civilizations that posed an existential threat to the Empire itself. Commander, interjected Science Director Yilnara, her tentacles weaving complex patterns of skepticism. Our long-range scans indicate the humans have achieved basic fusion technology and crude chemical propulsion. They haven't even established permanent colonies beyond their home system. What possible threat could they represent? Vexhai pulled up a holographic display, showing footage from his squadron's encounters. The three-dimensional images flickered to life above the chamber floor, showing scenes of battle that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their pods. This footage was recorded during our standard subjugation protocols on the human colony world of Proxima Centauri b. The settlement contained approximately 50,000 humans, defended by what their military classifications call colonial marines. The hologram showed Vexhi's force of 300 elite Zephyrian shock troops approaching what appeared to be a hastily constructed human outpost. The structures were crude by galactic standards, prefabricated metal buildings that wouldn't have impressed a Stone Age civilization from any other world. Standard doctrine called for a demonstration of overwhelming force to encourage swift surrender, Vexhi continued. We deployed atmospheric suppressors to reduce oxygen content by 15%, well within safe parameters for human physiology but sufficient to impair their combat effectiveness. Admiral Crexton nodded approvingly. The tactic was textbook Zephyrian strategy, designed to weaken resistance while preserving valuable population assets for integration into the Empire. However, Vexhi's voice took on a harder edge. The humans did not respond as predicted. The hologram shifted to show the first moments of contact. Zephyrian forces, towering nearly 3 meters tall and encased in powered armor that could deflect most known weapons, advanced across the rocky terrain with the mechanical precision of a species that had perfected the art of conquest. The human response was immediate and completely irrational. Instead of the expected surrender broadcasts or desperate attempts at negotiation, the colonists opened fire with weapons that shouldn't have been capable of penetrating Zephyrian armor. But, more disturbing than their surprising effectiveness was the humans' complete disregard for their own survival. Observe Section 7 Alpha, Vexhi commanded, highlighting a portion of the battle. The hologram zoomed in on a group of human defenders who had taken position behind what appeared to be agricultural equipment. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, yet they weren't retreating. Notice how they maintain formation even when retreat would be tactically sound, Vexhi pointed out. Now watch this individual. The image focused on a single human soldier, distinguishable only by the medical cross painted on her helmet. She was clearly wounded, green blood from her injuries visible even through her environmental suit, yet she continued to provide covering fire for her companions. This medic held her position for 47 minutes while treating wounded comrades, Vexhi explained. When our forces finally overran the position, we discovered she had suffered what our medical analysis confirmed as fatal wounds 23 minutes earlier. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. Director Yilnara's tentacles stiffened with suspicion. Commander, that's physiologically impossible. No species can maintain combat effectiveness with fatal injuries for that duration. I thought so too, Vexhi replied grimly. Until I reviewed the sensor logs. Her suit's life support had failed. She was operating in a compromised atmosphere while suffering from what our combat medics classified as unsurvivable trauma. Yet she continued to function. The hologram showed another section of the battle, this time focusing on a human who appeared to be directing the defense. His armor was blackened by plasma burns, and one arm hung useless at his side. This individual, identified as Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, coordinated resistance across 17 defensive positions while suffering from severe radiation poisoning and multiple projectile wounds. When our forces reached his command post, they found him still attempting to call in artillery support despite being clinically dead for approximately 6 minutes. The chamber fell silent. Even the bioluminescent wall patterns seemed to dim as the implications sank in. Admiral Crexton shifted in his pod, his confidence beginning to show cracks. Commander, are you suggesting these humans can somehow continue fighting after death? No, Admiral. I'm suggesting that their definition of death doesn't seem to include the same surrender mechanisms that every other species in our databases exhibits. Our xenobiologists have spent 3 cycles studying the recordings, and they've identified something they're calling determination cascade syndrome. Science Director Yilnara's interest was clearly piqued despite her skepticism. Explain. When humans face overwhelming odds, their stress response doesn't trigger the standard survival protocols we see in other species. Instead of seeking escape routes or surrender options, their neurochemistry appears to enter a feedback loop that increases aggression and pain tolerance while suppressing self-preservation instincts. Vexhi manipulated the hologram to show brain scans taken from captured humans during the battle. The neural activity patterns were unlike anything in the Imperial databases. These scans were taken from a human designated Corporal Williams after his capture. He had been fighting for 8 hours straight against impossible odds. Notice the activity in the limbic system and frontal cortex. Instead of the exhaustion and despair we would expect, his brain was producing endorphins and adrenaline at levels that should have been toxic. The Admiral leaned forward, his carapace shifting to deeper, more concerned hues. What was the final casualty assessment, Commander? Vexhi's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme discomfort. Of the 300 Zephyrian troops deployed, 147 were killed in action. 73 more required extensive medical treatment. The humans lost approximately 3,000 defenders. Those numbers seem reasonable for a standard subjugation, commented General Fexmore, his scarred hide showing the patterns of a veteran ground combat specialist. General, Vexhi's voice carried a weight that made the chamber's occupants shift nervously. We had orbital support, advanced weaponry, and a 10-to-1 numerical advantage. By all mathematical models, we should have suffered fewer than 20 casualties while neutralizing the entire human force within 2 hours. The silence that followed was profound. The Zephyrian Empire had built its dominance on the predictability of warfare. Superior technology, numbers, and tactics had worked against every species they had encountered. The idea that a primitive civilization could inflict such casualties was almost incomprehensible. Furthermore, Vexhi continued, our victory was Pyrrhic at best. The humans destroyed most of their infrastructure rather than allow it to fall into our hands. They poisoned their water supplies, collapsed their mine shafts, and even set explosive charges in their civilian shelters. When we finally secured the colony, we found it had been rendered essentially worthless. Director Yilnara's tentacles writhed with agitation. That's pure spite. No rational species would destroy resources rather than preserve them for negotiated surrender. Precisely my point, Director. The humans don't appear to operate under rational survival parameters. They would rather die fighting than live under conquest. Admiral Crexton stood, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber floor. Commander, your report is concerning. But surely this was an isolated incident. Perhaps this particular colony had been influenced by extremist elements or suffered from some form of mass psychosis. Vexhi's expression, barely visible beneath his battle helmet, remained grim. Admiral, I wish that were the case. However, during our withdrawal from the system, we monitored human communications. They were already sharing tactical analyses of our engagement, identifying weaknesses in our armor and weapons systems. More disturbing, they seemed to view our victory as a learning experience rather than a defeat. The hologram shifted again, showing intercepted communication transcripts floating in the air above the assembled council. These messages were broadcast on multiple frequencies throughout human space. They contained detailed tactical assessments, recommended countermeasures, and, most significantly, recruitment messages calling for volunteers to defend against future Zephyrian incursions. General Fexmore studied the transcripts with growing alarm. They're treating us like a training exercise. Worse, General. They're treating us like a challenge to be overcome. Intelligence estimates suggest that within 2 cycles, human military recruitment has increased by 400%. They're not preparing to surrender or negotiate. They're preparing for war. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices as representatives from across the empire began to debate the implications. Some called for immediate massive retaliation to crush human resistance before it could develop. Others suggested that the commander's assessment was flawed, that no species could be as irrational as he described. Admiral Crexton called for order, but the discussion continued to rage. Through it all, Vexhi stood silently, his scarred armor bearing witness to truths that the Empire wasn't ready to accept. As the debate reached a crescendo, the Admiral made his decision. Commander Vexhi, your service record is exemplary, and your concerns are noted. However, one difficult engagement does not constitute grounds for reclassifying an entire species. The Empire has faced challenging opponents before. Admiral, with respect, we have never faced opponents like this. Commander, the Admiral's voice carried a note of finality, the Empire will proceed with standard expansion protocols. Additional forces will be allocated to ensure swift subjugation of the Sol system. Your recommendations for increased caution are noted and will be taken under advisement. Vexai's mandibles clicked one final time. And, if I'm right, Admiral? If the humans prove to be everything I've described and more? Admiral Crexton's carapace shifted to the confident golds and blues of imperial certainty. Then, we will adapt and overcome, as we always have. The Empire has survived for millennia by being stronger than its enemies. A few determined primitives cannot change that. As the council session concluded and the assembled officials began to disperse, Vexai remained at attention in the center of the chamber. He had delivered his warning, provided his evidence, and made his recommendations. The fact that they were being dismissed was not his responsibility. But, as he finally turned to leave, Vexai couldn't shake the memory of Lieutenant Colonel Chen's final transmission, intercepted just before his command post was overrun. The human had been speaking to someone called Central Command, and his words had been burned into Vexai's memory. They're tough, but they're not invincible. We're learning their weaknesses. Tell Earth to get ready. Next time will be different. Next time. As if the humans were already planning for the next engagement, already assuming they would survive long enough to apply the lessons they had learned in defeat. Vexai made his way through the crystal corridors of the command complex, past the monuments to galactic conquest and the trophies taken from hundreds of defeated worlds. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if those trophies would still be here when the humans finally arrived. Because despite the Admiral's confidence and the Empire's overwhelming military superiority, Vexai had seen something in those human eyes during the battle that he had never encountered in 2 centuries of warfare. He had seen a species that truly believed they could win. 3 cycles had passed since Vexai's warning, and the Zephyrian Empire had proceeded with its expansion plans exactly as Admiral Crexton had outlined. The High Command had allocated what they considered overwhelming force to the Sol System's subjugation, an entire battle fleet comprising 400 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to swift attack cruisers, all under the command of Fleet Admiral Zirithkal, a legendary figure whose victories had brought 17 star systems into the Imperial fold. On the bridge of the flagship Dominion of Worlds, Admiral Zirithkal reviewed the tactical displays with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced a defeat. His elongated form, nearly 4 meters in height when fully extended, dominated the command platform. The intricate scarification covering his carapace told the story of his victories, each pattern representing a conquered world. Fleet status report, he commanded, his voice resonating through the bridge's organic acoustic systems. All ships report ready for emergence, Admiral, responded Navigation Officer Kesthyra. Long-range sensors confirm human activity throughout the Sol System, including significant military buildup around their 3rd planet. The Admiral's mandibles clicked in amusement. So the primitives have been busy. How significant could this buildup possibly be? Sir, our intelligence estimates suggest they've increased their space-based military assets by approximately 600% since the Proxima incident. However, the technology remains primitive by our standards. They appear to be using crude kinetic weapons and nuclear-based explosives. Captain Vorthon, the Admiral's chief tactical advisor, manipulated the holographic display to show recent reconnaissance data. The Sol System appeared before them in 3-dimensional detail, with human positions highlighted in red. Admiral, the humans have established defensive positions throughout their system. Asteroid-based weapon platforms, mobile patrol squadrons, and what appears to be a significant manufacturing infrastructure on their 4th planet. Admiral Zirithkal studied the display with professional interest. The human defensive setup showed a basic understanding of strategic positioning, but their technology levels remained laughably primitive. Their largest ships were smaller than Zephyrian escort vessels, and their weapon systems couldn't possibly penetrate Imperial shielding. Their response is more organized than anticipated, the Admiral admitted, but ultimately irrelevant. Deploy standard first contact protocols. Open communications and demand surrender in accordance with Imperial law. The fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol System, their massive forms blotting out stars as they arranged themselves in the traditional Zephyrian intimidation formation. The flagship took point position, flanked by the dreadnoughts Empire's Fist and Stellar Dominion, while cruiser squadrons spread out to prevent any human ships from escaping the system. Almost immediately, the human response challenged every assumption in the Imperial First Contact Manual. Admiral, Communications Officer Yexnala's tentacles quivered with confusion, were receiving multiple transmissions from the humans. They appear to be welcoming us? Welcoming? The Admiral's voice carried genuine surprise. Explain. Sir, they're broadcasting on multiple frequencies in several languages. The primary message appears to be an invitation to talks. The main display flickered to life, showing the face of a human female in what appeared to be some form of military uniform. Her species' peculiar forward-facing eyes seemed to look directly at Admiral Zirithkal as she spoke. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force," the human said, her voice carrying none of the fear or desperation typical of species facing imperial conquest. "We extend greetings to the Zephyrian Empire and invite your representatives to Earth for formal diplomatic discussions." The bridge fell silent. In 2 millennia of expansion, no species had ever invited the Empire to talks after witnessing their battle fleet's arrival. Admiral Zirithkal's carapace shifted to patterns of bewilderment. "Play their message again." The human admiral's image repeated her invitation, this time adding additional details. "We've prepared facilities for your delegation and have taken the liberty of studying your atmospheric and dietary requirements. We believe we have much to discuss regarding our respective civilizations and their potential interactions." Captain Vorthon's scarred hide rippled with confusion. "Admiral, this response is completely outside normal parameters. They should be demanding our intentions or attempting to negotiate for their survival. Instead, they're acting as if they called us here." "Perhaps they're simply naive," suggested Navigation Officer Kesthyra. "Many primitive species don't understand the implications of Imperial First Contact." Admiral Zirithkal considered this possibility, but something about the human admiral's demeanor suggested otherwise. Her confidence seemed genuine rather than born of ignorance. "Admiral Chen," he finally responded, activating the communication array, "I am Fleet Admiral Zirithkal of the Zephyrian Empire. You stand before the representative force of an interstellar civilization that has brought peace and prosperity to over 300 worlds. We offer your species the opportunity to join our great empire and benefit from our advanced technology and wisdom." The standard first contact speech had been refined over centuries to emphasize both the benefits of cooperation and the futility of resistance. Most species requested time to consider the offer, during which their leaders typically attempted to negotiate for favorable terms of surrender. Admiral Chen's response was immediate and completely unexpected. "That's a fascinating offer, Admiral Zirithkal. We'd be very interested in learning more about your empire's governance structure and expansion methodologies. However, we should mention that we've had some experience with your military capabilities through the events at Proxima Centauri. We found that engagement quite educational." The bridge crew exchanged glances of alarm. The human was referring to the Proxima incident not as a defeat, but as a learning experience. "Admiral Chen," Zirithkal's voice took on a harder edge, "the Proxima engagement demonstrated the futility of resistance to Imperial forces. Surely your leaders understand the wisdom of peaceful integration." The human's expression shifted slightly, and, for the first time, Admiral Zirithkal saw something that made his combat instincts twinge with unease. It wasn't fear or desperation. It was the look of someone who had been hoping for exactly this conversation. "Admiral, we analyzed your tactics and capabilities quite thoroughly during and after the Proxima engagement. Your forces are indeed formidable, and we have great respect for your military prowess. However, we noticed several areas where improvements might be possible." "Improvements?" Captain Vorthon's voice carried naked incredulity. "Admiral, are these primitives actually attempting to offer us tactical advice?" Admiral Chen continued as if she hadn't heard the interruption. "For example, your atmospheric suppression technique, while elegant in theory, assumes that the target species requires consistent oxygen levels for optimal performance. Humans actually function quite well under various atmospheric conditions, particularly when sufficiently motivated." Admiral Zirithkal felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. The human wasn't just referring to their resistance at Proxima, she was discussing it as if she had studied Imperial tactics specifically to counter them. Additionally, Admiral Chen continued, your armor systems appear optimized against energy weapons and high-temperature plasma. Very sophisticated engineering. However, our ballistics specialists noted some interesting vulnerabilities to kinetic impacts at specific angles and velocities. The bridge cruise alarm was now palpable. Navigation Officer Kesthyra was frantically checking sensor readings, looking for signs of hidden human weapons that could pose a threat to Imperial armor. Admiral Chen, Zirithkal said carefully, are you suggesting that your species intends to resist Imperial integration? The human smile was neither fearful nor aggressive. It was the smile of someone who had spent a long time preparing for this exact moment. Admiral, we're suggesting that any such resistance would be far more educational for both our species than the engagement at Proxima. We've spent considerable time and resources preparing for this conversation, and we're very much looking forward to demonstrating what we've learned. Before Admiral Zirithkal could respond, his sensor officer's urgent voice cut through the bridge. Admiral. Massive energy signatures throughout the system. Multiple contacts emerging from asteroid concealment. Sir, they're everywhere. The tactical display exploded into activity as hundreds of previously hidden human ships revealed themselves. They had been using the asteroid belt and the system's outer planets as concealment, positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated ambush. But, more disturbing than their numbers was their behavior. Instead of the desperate charge typical of doomed defenders, the human ships moved with precise coordination, taking up positions that demonstrated clear understanding of Zephyrian tactical doctrines. Sir, the sensor officer continued, his voice tight with disbelief, I'm reading approximately 800 human vessels, ranging from single-person fighters to ships nearly as large as our cruisers. They're arranging themselves in what appears to be a modified version of our own Telone formation. Admiral Zirithkal stared at the display in growing horror. The Telone formation was an advanced Zephyrian battle strategy, classified at the highest levels and known only to fleet commanders with centuries of experience. There was no way a primitive species could have learned it from a single engagement. Admiral Chen, he said slowly, how do you know our tactical formations? The human's smile widened. Admiral, did you really think that Lieutenant Colonel Chen was chosen randomly for the defense of Proxima? He's my nephew, and one of our most gifted tactical analysts. Every move your forces made was recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to Earth before the engagement concluded. The implications hit Admiral Zirithkal like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just survived the Proxima engagement, they had deliberately used it as a testing ground to study Imperial capabilities. They had sacrificed 3,000 of their own people not in a desperate last stand, but as part of a calculated intelligence-gathering operation. You used your own people as bait, Captain Vorthon breathed, his scarred hide showing patterns of grudging respect mixed with revulsion. We used volunteers who understood the strategic necessity, Admiral Chen corrected. Every person who died at Proxima knew they were giving their lives so that their species might survive. That's what humans do, Admiral Zirithkal. We adapt, we learn, and we make the hard choices that our survival requires. The sensor displays continued to update as more human assets revealed themselves. Weapon platforms hidden throughout the system powered up, revealing energy signatures that suggested technology far more advanced than Imperial intelligence had indicated. Admiral, the sensor officer reported, his voice cracking with strain, long-range scans are detecting massive energy buildups throughout human space. Sir, it appears they've been retrofitting their entire system as a defensive fortress. Admiral Chen's image leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Admiral Zirithkal, we want you to understand something important. Humanity doesn't want this fight. We would genuinely prefer peaceful coexistence with your empire. But, we've studied your expansion history, and we know that your definition of peaceful integration involves the complete subjugation of indigenous populations. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. That's not acceptable to us. We'd rather die fighting than live as subjects. And if we're going to die, we intend to make it so educational that your empire thinks very carefully before attempting to subjugate any other species. The bridge fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the human strategy became clear. They weren't just preparing to resist, they were preparing to inflict such devastating casualties that the Empire would be forced to reconsider its entire approach to expansion. Admiral Zirithkal found himself in a position he had never experienced in his long career. He commanded overwhelming force by any conventional measure, but the humans had spent 3 years preparing specifically for this engagement. They had studied his tactics, analyzed his technology, and positioned themselves to exploit every weakness they had identified. "Admiral Chen," he said finally, "you understand that the Empire cannot allow your resistance to succeed. If one species successfully defies Imperial expansion, others will follow. The stability of our entire civilization depends on the inevitability of our conquest." The human nodded gravely. "We understand perfectly, Admiral. That's exactly what we're counting on." When word spreads throughout your empire that a primitive species armed with kinetic weapons and nuclear explosives held off 400 Imperial ships, every subjugated population in your territory is going to start wondering if they need to stay subjugated. The threat was clear, and Admiral Zirithkal realized with growing dread that the humans had maneuvered him into an impossible position. If he withdrew, he would appear weak and potentially inspire rebellion throughout the Empire. If he attacked, he would be fighting an enemy that had spent years preparing specifically for his tactics and capabilities. "So," Admiral Chen concluded, her smile returning, "shall we begin those educational discussions we mentioned? I think you'll find them quite enlightening." As Admiral Zirithkal stared at the tactical displays showing hundreds of human ships in perfect position to exploit every vulnerability the Empire had never known it possessed, he finally understood why Commander Vexhai had been so desperate to warn them. The humans weren't just primitive defenders fighting for their survival. They were a species that had looked at the most powerful military force in the galaxy and decided to turn it into a learning opportunity. And now the real education was about to begin. Admiral Zirithkal had commanded Imperial fleets for over 3 centuries, but he had never faced a decision quite like this one. The tactical displays surrounding him showed a situation that defied every principle of conventional warfare. His 400 ships held overwhelming technological superiority, yet the humans had positioned themselves to neutralize almost every advantage the Empire typically relied upon. "Admiral," Captain Vorthon spoke quietly, "we should withdraw and reassess. The humans have clearly prepared countermeasures we weren't expecting." The suggestion was logical, but Admiral Zirithkal knew it was impossible. The entire Empire was watching this engagement through quantum communication relays. Retreat in the face of primitive opposition would shatter the mystique of Imperial invincibility that had kept 300 conquered worlds in line. "Negative, Captain. We proceed with the engagement. Signal all ships to assume attack formation Beta 7. These humans may have studied our tactics, but they've never experienced the full weight of an Imperial battle fleet." Even as he gave the order, Admiral Zirithkal felt a nagging uncertainty. Admiral Chen's confidence had been too genuine, too specific. Her mention of ballistic vulnerabilities in Imperial armor suggested intelligence that should have been impossible for a primitive species to acquire. The Imperial fleet began its advance, 400 ships moving with the coordinated precision that had terrified civilizations across the galaxy. The massive dreadnoughts led the charge, their fusion drives painting space with streams of superheated plasma. Behind them, cruiser squadrons spread into the complex geometric patterns that maximized their overlapping defensive fields. The human response was immediate and completely unexpected. Instead of the desperate charge or futile defensive positioning that characterized most species facing Imperial assault, the human ships began a coordinated withdrawal toward the inner system. But their movement wasn't retreat, it was repositioning, drawing the Imperial fleet deeper into the killing ground they had spent 3 years preparing. "Admiral," the sensor officer called out, his voice tight with confusion, "the humans appear to be leading us toward their homeworld. Their formation suggests they're trying to draw us into close-range engagement near planetary orbit." Admiral Zirithkal studied the tactical display, his experienced eye recognizing the human strategy. They were sacrificing the advantages of deep space maneuvering to fight near their planet, where their knowledge of local conditions would be greatest. It was tactically sound for a desperate defense, but it also meant they were accepting that Earth itself might be destroyed in the battle. "They're willing to see their homeworld burn rather than surrender," Captain Vorthon observed. These creatures truly are as irrational as Commander Vexai claimed. But, as the Imperial fleet closed the distance, Admiral Zirithkal began to notice details that challenged that assessment. The human withdrawal wasn't panicked or disorganized. Their ships moved with purpose, each vessel following what appeared to be predetermined routes that kept them just outside optimal Imperial weapons range while maintaining their own formation integrity. "Sir," the weapons officer reported, "we're approaching effective firing range of the lead human elements. Requesting permission to engage." "Granted. Target their largest vessels first. Demonstrate our superiority and, perhaps the rest will see reason." The Dominion of Worlds opened fire, its massive plasma cannons painting space with deadly energy. The other dreadnoughts followed suit, creating a coordinated barrage that should have vaporized the targeted human ships instantly. Instead, the humans did something no other species had ever attempted. They scattered. Not in the panicked flight typical of outmatched opponents, but in a carefully orchestrated dispersal that presented the Imperial weapons with a rapidly changing array of targets. Worse, as they scattered, they began firing their own weapons. The first kinetic round struck the Imperial fleet 30 seconds later. Admiral Zirithkal felt the Dominion of Worlds shudder under impacts that shouldn't have been possible. Human weapons were primitive projectile systems, incapable of penetrating Imperial shielding. Yet his ship's damage reports showed actual hull breaches in 3 sections. "Report," he demanded. "Sir, the human projectiles are moving at approximately 15% of light speed. They appear to be using some form of magnetic acceleration system we hadn't detected. The velocity is sufficient to overwhelm our defensive screens through kinetic energy alone." The implications were staggering. The humans had developed weapons that bypassed Imperial defensive technology not through superior energy output, but through brute kinetic force. It was crude, inefficient, and completely effective. "Adapt defensive posture to kinetic threats," Admiral Zirithkal ordered. "Increase point defense coverage and modify shield harmonics." But, even as his fleet began implementing countermeasures, the true scope of the human strategy became apparent. The scattered human ships weren't just avoiding Imperial fire, they were herding the Empire fleet into specific positions. Each course correction to pursue human vessels moved the Imperial formation closer to predetermined coordinates. "Admiral," the navigation officer called out urgently, "massive energy signatures ahead. The humans have weapon platforms positioned throughout this region." The tactical display updated to show hundreds of previously hidden installations scattered across asteroids, abandoned spacecraft, and even what appeared to be modified communication satellites. Each platform was small enough to have escaped initial detection, but together they represented a defensive network of unprecedented scope. "They've fortified their entire system," Captain Vorthon breathed. "Every asteroid, every piece of space debris has been turned into a potential weapons platform." Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the communication system. "Admiral Zirithkal, we thought you should understand what you're facing before the engagement escalates further. You're currently surrounded by approximately 2,000 defensive installations, each equipped with kinetic weapons calibrated specifically for Zephyrian armor penetration." The Admiral's carapace shifted to patterns of grudging respect. The humans had spent 3 years turning their home system into a death trap, using their own civilian infrastructure as camouflage for a military buildup of staggering proportions. Furthermore, Admiral Chen continued, "We should mention that every engagement parameter we're using has been tested against captured Imperial equipment from Proxima. We know exactly how much kinetic force is required to breach your hull plating at specific angles." Admiral Zirithkal's blood chilled. The humans hadn't just analyzed Imperial tactics, they had somehow acquired actual Imperial hardware for testing. The Battle of Proxima had provided them with samples of everything from personal armor to ship components. "How?" he demanded over the open channel. "How did you acquire Imperial technology?" Admiral Chen's response carried a note of what might have been pride. "Admiral, your forces at Proxima fought magnificently, but they made one critical error. They assumed that human dead were actually dead." The implications hit Admiral Zirithkal like a physical blow. The humans had somehow survived what Imperial sensors registered as fatal wounds, allowing them to collect Imperial equipment after Zephyrian forces had withdrawn from the battlefield. Several of our Marines maintained consciousness long enough after your withdrawal to gather intelligence on your equipment, Admiral Chen explained. They died knowing their sacrifice would give their species the information needed to fight back effectively. Captain Vorthon's scarred hide showed patterns of horrified admiration. They used their own deaths as an intelligence operation. The human defensive network chose that moment to open fire. 2,000 kinetic weapons fired simultaneously, creating a crossfire pattern that covered every possible evasion route the Imperial fleet might attempt. The projectiles moved too fast for effective point defense and hit too hard for standard shielding to absorb. The Imperial fleet, caught in formation and expecting to face primitive resistance, found itself under assault from weapons that exploited every vulnerability they possessed. Hull plating designed to deflect energy weapons crumpled under kinetic impacts. Defensive screens optimized for plasma and particle beams offered no protection against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. Within minutes, Admiral Zirithkul's seemingly invincible battle fleet was taking casualties that shouldn't have been possible. Damage report, he shouted over the sound of secondary explosions echoing through his flagship. Sir, we've lost 17 escort vessels and the dreadnought Stellar Dominion is reporting critical damage to main engines. The humans are targeting our propulsion systems specifically. Admiral Zirithkul realized with growing horror that the humans weren't trying to destroy his fleet outright. They were systematically crippling Imperial mobility, trapping his ships in a killing field where they could be picked apart at leisure. All ships, emergency scatter protocol. Break formation and attempt individual escape vectors. But, even as he gave the order, Admiral Zirithkul knew it was too late. The humans had anticipated this response, positioning their mobile forces to intercept scattered Imperial ships. Worse, they were demonstrating tactical coordination that rivaled the Empire's own elite formations. Admiral, the communications officer called out, were receiving messages from multiple Imperial ships. Captain Thiax Nal of the Empire's Fist reports his vessel is surrounded by human fighters. They're not attempting to destroy his ship, they appear to be forcing him into surrender. The tactical display showed the unthinkable, Imperial vessels being systematically captured by primitive humans using nothing more than superior positioning and kinetic weapons. The humans were treating the most advanced military technology in the galaxy like wild animals to be herded and corralled. Admiral Chen's voice returned to the communication channel, calm and professional despite the ongoing battle. Admiral Zirithkul, were prepared to offer terms. Terms? Admiral Zirithkul's voice carried naked incredulity. His fleet was being systematically destroyed by primitives, and they wanted to negotiate? Yes. We propose a prisoner exchange and withdrawal agreement. Your surviving crews will be returned unharmed to Imperial space, along with detailed intelligence on our capabilities and tactics. In return, the Empire agrees to reclassify the Sol system as restricted territory and withdraws all claims to human space. The offer was reasonable, which made it all the more galling. The humans were offering mercy to the representatives of a civilization that had come to conquer them. And, if we refuse? Admiral Zirithkul asked, though he already knew the answer. Then, we continue this engagement until your fleet is completely neutralized. We'll still return your survivors to Imperial space, but the intelligence they carry will be far more detailed and significantly more embarrassing to Imperial prestige. Admiral Zirithkul looked at his tactical displays, showing Imperial ships being systematically outmaneuvered and captured by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. His fleet, the pride of the Zephyrian Empire, was being used as a training exercise by creatures who had learned warfare by studying a single engagement. Admiral Chen, he said finally, what do you want? What we've wanted from the beginning, Admiral. To be left alone. We don't want to conquer your empire or liberate your subject species. We just want the right to exist without interference. The simplicity of the demand was almost insulting. The humans weren't seeking revenge for Proxima, weren't demanding reparations or territory. They simply wanted to be left alone to develop their civilization without imperial interference. The Empire cannot simply ignore a successful resistance, Admiral Zirithkul explained. If word spreads that humans defeated an Imperial fleet, it could inspire rebellion throughout our territory. Then, I suggest you control what word spreads, Admiral Chen replied. Tell your empire that humans are dangerous, unpredictable, and not worth the cost of conquest. Make us your bogeyman if you must, but leave us alone. Admiral Zerethkal considered the offer as explosions continued to light up space around his flagship. The humans had demonstrated that they could inflict unacceptable casualties on Imperial forces, but they were also offering a face-saving withdrawal that wouldn't completely shatter Imperial prestige. I need to consult with High Command, he said finally. Of course, Admiral. Take all the time you need. We'll be here. As Admiral Zerethkal opened communication channels to the distant Zephyrian capital, he couldn't help but notice that Admiral Chen's promise carried the absolute confidence of someone who controlled the tactical situation completely. The humans would indeed be here, ready to continue their education of Imperial forces for as long as necessary. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Zerethkal found himself hoping that his superiors would be willing to learn. The emergency session of the Zephyrian High Command convened within hours of Admiral Zerethkal's desperate transmission from the Sol system. The great crystal chamber, usually pulsing with the confident blues and golds of Imperial authority, now flickered with the angry reds and deep purples of a civilization confronting the impossible. Admiral Crexton stood before the assembled council, his ceremonial carapace dulled by the magnitude of the crisis he was addressing. Around him, representatives from across the Empire watched holographic displays showing the tactical situation in human space with growing disbelief. Council members, Admiral Crexton began, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. The situation in the Sol system has developed beyond our most pessimistic projections. Admiral Zerethkal's battle fleet is effectively neutralized. The chamber erupted in voices speaking dozens of languages, all expressing the same fundamental incredulity. General Thexmore's scarred hide showed patterns of rage as he manipulated the tactical displays. How is this possible? 400 ships, including 6 dreadnoughts and our most experienced crews. They should have been able to subdue these primitives in hours. Science Director Yilnara's tentacles writhed with agitation as she reviewed the sensor data flowing in from the battle zone. The humans appear to have developed countermeasures for every system we deployed against them. Their intelligence on our capabilities is impossibly comprehensive. Because we gave it to them, a familiar voice said from the chamber's entrance. The assembled council turned to see Commander Vexhai entering the chamber, his battle armor still bearing the scars of the Proxima engagement. His presence was unauthorized, but none of the guards moved to intercept him. Commander, Admiral Crexton's voice carried a warning, this is a closed session of the High Command. Admiral, Vexhai replied, his mandibles clicking with barely controlled emotion, with respect, this crisis exists precisely because this was a closed session 3 cycles ago. Every disaster currently unfolding in human space was predicted in my initial report. General Thexmore's scarred form shifted to aggressive postures. Commander, you're speaking to your superiors. The Empire's decisions are not subject to second-guessing by field officers. Vexhai's response carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and lost too many comrades to care about protocol. General, my superiors just sent the finest fleet in Imperial service to be destroyed by primitives using weapons we could have detected and countered if anyone had bothered to take my warnings seriously. The holographic displays continued to update with real-time data from the Sol system, showing Imperial ships being systematically captured or disabled. The sight of Zephyrian dreadnoughts surrounded by swarms of human fighters was almost incomprehensible to beings raised on the myth of Imperial invincibility. Science Director Yilnara's tentacles stiffened with scientific curiosity overriding political considerations. Commander Vexhai, your report mentioned unusual human behavior patterns. Are you suggesting these creatures are fundamentally different from other species? Director, I'm suggesting that we've spent 2 millennia conquering civilizations that shared our basic assumptions about survival, self-preservation, and rational behavior. The humans don't share those assumptions. Vexhai manipulated the holographic display to show footage from the ongoing battle. Imperial ships, designed to inspire awe and terror in potential enemies, were being herded like livestock by creatures in primitive spacecraft that looked like they had been assembled from industrial equipment. Observe their tactics, Vexhai continued. They're not trying to escape or negotiate. They're not preserving their forces for a strategic withdrawal. They're accepting catastrophic casualties to maximize damage to our fleet. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The tactical displays showed human ships deliberately ramming Imperial vessels, using their own destruction to create debris fields that would interfere with Zephyrian maneuvering. They're committing suicide, General Thexmore breathed. No, General. They're making strategic sacrifices. Every human ship that destroys itself while disabling an Imperial vessel improves the odds for their surviving forces. They've calculated that trading individual lives for tactical advantage will allow their species to survive. Admiral Crexton studied the displays with growing unease. Commander, are you suggesting that every human in their military is willing to die for their cause? Admiral, I'm suggesting that every human in their military has already accepted that they're probably going to die for their cause. That removes the fear of death as a limiting factor in their decision-making. The concept was almost impossible for the Zephyrian leadership to process. Imperial doctrine was built on the assumption that all intelligent species valued individual survival above all other considerations. Military tactics, diplomatic strategies, even the Empire's governing philosophy depended on the predictable behavior of beings who wanted to continue living. Science Director Yilnara's scientific training allowed her to grasp the implications first. If they don't fear death, then conventional intimidation tactics are useless. We can't threaten them into submission because they're not afraid of the consequences. Exactly, Vexhai confirmed. But it's worse than that. They don't just accept death, they use it as a weapon. Every human who dies fighting us becomes propaganda that motivates others to fight harder. The holographic displays chose that moment to update with new intelligence from the battle zone. Admiral Zirithkal's voice, transmitted across light years of space, filled the chamber with the strain of a commander facing impossible odds. High Command, the humans have offered terms for withdrawal. They're willing to release our captured personnel and allow fleet withdrawal in exchange for recognition of Sol system sovereignty. The offer should have been insulting. Primitive aliens were offering mercy to the representatives of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. Yet everyone in the chamber understood that refusing might mean the complete destruction of one of their finest battle fleets. What are their demands? Admiral Crexton asked. Complete withdrawal from human space, recognition of their territorial claims, and reclassification of humans as a prohibited contact species. The terms were reasonable, which made them even more galling. The humans weren't seeking conquest or reparations, they simply wanted to be left alone to develop their civilization without interference. General Thexmore's scarred hide showed patterns of frustrated rage. This is unacceptable. If we negotiate with these primitives, every subjugated species in the Empire will begin to question our authority. General, Vexhai's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen the same arguments lead to the same disasters. They're already questioning our authority. Right now, every conquered world in the Empire is watching our finest fleet being dismantled by creatures with kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. The chamber's communication array crackled with incoming transmissions from across Imperial space. Reports of increased resistance activity, unauthorized political assemblies, and requests for clarification of Imperial policy toward human space. Word of the engagement was spreading despite attempts to maintain communication security. Science Director Yilnara manipulated her tentacles to access classified intelligence reports. Council members, I'm reviewing preliminary analysis of captured human technology. Their kinetic weapons are indeed primitive, but they've been optimized specifically to exploit weaknesses in Imperial defensive systems. She activated a technical display showing detailed schematics of human weapons alongside Imperial armor specifications. The correlation was impossible to ignore. They've reverse-engineered our defenses from captured equipment and developed countermeasures that neutralize our technological advantages. This represents a level of analytical capability we've never encountered. Admiral Crexton's carapace showed patterns of grudging admiration mixed with deep concern. How long would such analysis take using conventional methods? For a civilization at their technological level? Decades, possibly centuries. They accomplished it in 3 cycles. The implications were staggering. The humans had compressed generations of technological development into 3 years through pure analytical brilliance and an apparently unlimited willingness to sacrifice resources for military advancement. HFY activated additional displays showing intelligence estimates of human military production. Council members, the humans have converted their entire civilization to military production. They've sacrificed economic development, infrastructure improvement, even population growth to maximize their military capabilities. The scale of the sacrifice was almost incomprehensible. An entire species had voluntarily reduced their quality of life to near subsistence levels in order to build the weapons needed to fight the Empire. They've turned their homeworld into a fortress, HFY continued. Every manufacturing facility, every research center, every educational institution has been repurposed for military applications. They've created a war economy that treats every resource as potential ammunition. General Thexmore studied the intelligence reports with professional interest overriding his political objections. This level of mobilization is unsustainable. They'll exhaust their resources within a few cycles. General, respectfully, that assumes they intend to survive the conflict. Everything we've observed suggests they're prepared for a war of extinction. They're not planning for post-war reconstruction because they don't expect to have a post-war period. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full scope of human determination became clear. They weren't facing a conventional enemy seeking military victory, they were facing a species that had committed to either achieving independence or dying in the attempt. Admiral Crexton activated the communication array to contact Admiral Zirithkul directly. Admiral, what's your assessment of human military capabilities? The response carried the strain of a commander who had watched the impossible become routine. Admiral, they've demonstrated tactical innovation I've never encountered. They're using our own doctrines against us while implementing strategies that exploit psychological weaknesses we didn't know we had. Elaborate. Sir, they're not just fighting to win individual engagements. They're fighting to make each engagement so costly that we'll be forced to reconsider the entire war. Every tactical victory they achieve comes with a price designed to make us question whether human space is worth conquering. The strategic implications were clear, and Admiral Crexton found himself facing the possibility that the Empire had encountered its first truly unwinnable war. Not because the humans were militarily superior, but because they had made victory so expensive that it would bankrupt the Imperial war machine. Admiral Zirithkul, he said finally, are you recommending acceptance of human terms? The long pause before the response spoke volumes about the pride Admiral Zirithkul was being forced to swallow. Admiral, I'm recommending that we avoid learning any more lessons about human warfare. They're teaching us things about combat that I'm not sure the Empire is ready to understand. As the High Command prepared to debate the most humiliating decision in Imperial history, HFY made his way to the chamber's observation platform. Through the crystal walls, he could see the monuments to galactic conquest that had defined Zephyrian civilization for 2 millennia. Tomorrow, those monuments might still represent Imperial power throughout most of the galaxy. But they would also represent the acknowledgement that there was at least one species the Empire had chosen not to fight. And, in making that choice, the Empire would be admitting that sometimes the strongest response to a challenge is the wisdom to walk away. 5 cycles had passed since the Zephyrian Empire officially reclassified human space as restricted territory, a diplomatic euphemism that fooled no one throughout the galaxy. The decision to withdraw from the Sol system had sent shockwaves through Imperial space that continued to reverberate across hundreds of worlds. In the crystal chambers of the High Command, Admiral Crexton reviewed reports that painted a picture of an empire struggling to maintain its authority in the face of unprecedented challenges. The bioluminescent walls pulsed with the subdued colors of an organization grappling with the implications of its first strategic defeat in over a millennium. Status report on the Rigel sector, Admiral Crexton commanded, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been delivering increasingly dire briefings to increasingly skeptical superiors. Intelligence Director Zex Thyra's tentacles manipulated the holographic displays with practiced efficiency. Admiral, the Rigelian independence movement has escalated beyond local security forces' ability to contain. They're requesting significant military reinforcement. The tactical display showed a star system in open rebellion, with Imperial installations under siege and supply convoys being systematically intercepted by local resistance forces. It was a scenario that had played out on 17 different worlds since the human incident. What's their tactical assessment? Sir, the Rigelians appear to be employing modified human strategies. They've analyzed our responses to human tactics and adapted them to their own capabilities and resources. Admiral Crexton felt his carapace shift to patterns of frustrated resignation. The humans hadn't just defeated an Imperial fleet, they had provided a blueprint for successful resistance that was spreading throughout the galaxy. Science Director Yilnara entered the chamber, her usually precise movements showing signs of exhaustion. She had spent the past 5 cycles attempting to develop countermeasures for human-inspired tactics, with limited success. Director, Admiral Crexton acknowledged her presence. Please tell me you have positive news about tactical adaptations. Admiral, I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we anticipated. The human approach to warfare isn't just a collection of tactics we can counter, it's a fundamental philosophical shift in how conflicts are conceived and prosecuted. She activated a comprehensive analysis showing resistance movements throughout Imperial space. Each rebellion displayed characteristics that clearly demonstrated human influence, despite the Empire's best efforts to prevent such contamination. The humans appear to be sharing their tactical innovations with any species willing to employ them against Imperial forces, Director Yilnara continued. We've intercepted communications indicating direct human advisement of multiple independence movements. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't content with defending their own space, they were actively undermining Imperial authority throughout the galaxy by teaching other species how to fight effectively against Zephyrian forces. How are they disseminating this information? Admiral Crexton demanded. Our communication monitoring should detect any large-scale intelligence sharing. Sir, they're not using conventional communication methods. The humans have developed what appears to be a decentralized information network that operates through cultural exchange, trade relationships, and even entertainment media. Director Yilnara manipulated the displays to show examples of human cultural products that had somehow found their way into Imperial space. Stories, games, and art that contained detailed tactical information disguised as fiction. They're teaching resistance through storytelling, she explained. Tales of successful rebellion, accounts of effective asymmetric warfare tactics, and philosophical treatises on the right of species to self-determination. All presented as entertainment or cultural exchange. Admiral Crexton studied the examples with growing alarm. Human creativity had found ways to spread military intelligence that Imperial censors couldn't effectively detect or counter. Furthermore, Director Yil_Nara continued, the humans have established what they call cultural exchange programs with multiple species throughout the galaxy. These appear to be legitimate educational and diplomatic initiatives, but they also serve as cover for sharing tactical knowledge. The Chamber's communication array activated, indicating an urgent transmission from the frontier sectors. Admiral Crexton accepted the communication, and the image of Fleet Commander Kexval appeared in the Chamber's center. Admiral, Commander Kexval's voice carried the strain of someone delivering unwelcome news. I'm reporting from the Andorian border region. The situation has deteriorated significantly. Elaborate, Commander. Sir, we've encountered what appears to be a joint human-Andorian fleet conducting operations in neutral space. The humans are providing tactical support and advanced weaponry to Andorian independence forces. The display updated to show footage of the engagement, revealing scenes that challenged every assumption about human isolationism. Human ships, clearly identifiable by their distinctive design philosophy, were operating in direct cooperation with alien vessels against Imperial forces. Admiral, Commander Kexval continued, the humans aren't just defending their own territory anymore. They're actively supporting liberation movements throughout the galaxy. Admiral Crexton felt the foundations of Imperial strategy crumbling beneath him. The Empire's entire expansion model depended on the isolation of resistance movements, preventing them from coordinating or sharing resources. The humans had systematically dismantled that isolation. What's their stated justification for intervention? Sir, they claim to be providing humanitarian assistance to species seeking self-determination. they've established what they call the Galactic Liberation Support Network, which provides tactical training, equipment, and direct military assistance to any species fighting for independence. The concept was revolutionary and completely contrary to accepted galactic politics. For millennia, interstellar civilizations had operated under the principle that expansion and conquest were natural rights of superior species. The humans were challenging the fundamental assumptions that governed galactic civilization. Admiral, Director Yilnara interjected, "We need to consider the possibility that the humans are implementing a long-term strategy to fundamentally reshape galactic politics." Explain. Sir, human historical records indicate a species with extensive experience in revolution and liberation warfare. They appear to be applying those experiences on a galactic scale. She activated displays showing human historical conflicts, demonstrating patterns of behavior that had been replicated in their resistance to imperial expansion. The humans have a cultural concept they call spreading freedom, which involves active support for liberation movements regardless of the personal cost to their own civilization. Admiral Crexton studied the historical data with growing unease. Human civilization was barely 3 centuries old in terms of space travel, yet their planet showed evidence of countless revolutions, independence movements, and liberation wars spanning millennia. They're experienced rebels, he realized. This isn't their first revolution, it's just their largest. Exactly, Admiral. And they're treating the galaxy as their largest classroom for teaching others how to successfully rebel against established authority. The chamber's emergency communication system activated, indicating priority transmissions from multiple sectors simultaneously. Admiral Crexton activated the array, and his command platform was suddenly surrounded by the images of fleet commanders from across the Empire. Admiral, Commander Yex Thurin of the Outer Rim Fleet spoke first. We're reporting coordinated rebellions in 7 systems. The resistance forces are employing identical tactics and appear to be operating under unified command. Admiral, added Commander Thiexval of the Core Defense Fleet, we've intercepted communications suggesting that human military advisors are present in multiple conflict zones throughout Imperial space. The reports continue to flood in, painting a picture of galactic rebellion that exceeded the Empire's ability to respond effectively. The humans had apparently spent 5 cycles building a network of resistance movements that could challenge Imperial authority on dozens of worlds simultaneously. Admiral Crexton realized with growing horror that the Empire was facing something unprecedented in its history, a coordinated revolution spanning multiple star systems and dozens of species. Director Yilnara, he said quietly, what's your assessment of our ability to counter this Galactic Liberation Network? The science director's tentacles moved in patterns of deep concern as she reviewed the tactical data. Admiral, the humans have created a situation where every action we take to suppress one rebellion provides intelligence and propaganda material for all the others. She manipulated the displays to show the interconnected nature of the resistance movements. Each Imperial response to rebellion was being analyzed, countered, and shared throughout the network, creating a learning system that improved faster than Imperial tactics could adapt. We're not fighting individual rebellions, Admiral. We're fighting a single, distributed organism that learns from every engagement and shares that knowledge instantaneously across the galaxy. The implications were clear, and Admiral Crexton found himself confronting the possibility that the Zephyrian Empire had encountered something more dangerous than a military threat. The humans had created an ideological virus that was spreading throughout Imperial space, convincing subject species that independence was possible and providing them with the tools to achieve it. Admiral, Director Yilnara continued, I believe we need to consider the possibility that the human strategy isn't aimed at destroying the Empire, but at transforming it. Transforming it how? Sir, if current trends continue, the Empire will be forced to transition from a conquest-based expansion model to a voluntary association of independent worlds. The humans appear to be engineering a situation where cooperation becomes more profitable than conquest. The concept was almost incomprehensible to beings raised on Imperial supremacy, yet the evidence was undeniable. Human actions were systematically undermining the foundations of forced expansion while providing alternatives that benefited all participants. Admiral Crexton activated the communication array to contact the one being who had predicted this entire scenario. Commander Vexhai, report to the High Command immediately. Minutes later, the scarred veteran entered the chamber, his bearing showing the quiet satisfaction of someone whose warnings had finally been heeded.
Commander, Admiral Crexton began, your assessment of the current galactic situation? Admiral, the humans are doing exactly what I warned they would do.
They've learned from their engagement with us and applied those lessons on a scale we never imagined possible.
And, your recommendation?
Vexhi's mandibles clicked once, the gesture carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom.
Admiral, we negotiate.
Not just with the humans, but with everyone. We transform the Empire from a conquest force into a legitimate government that species choose to join rather than are forced to accept. That would mean abandoning 2 millennia of imperial expansion.
Admiral, that expansion is already over.
The humans have made it impossible to continue. We can either adapt to the new reality they've created, or watch our empire dissolve into chaos as every subject world follows their example. As Admiral Crexton contemplated the end of everything his civilization had built, he realized that Commander Vexhi was right. The humans hadn't just defeated an imperial fleet, they had changed the fundamental rules of galactic civilization. And, perhaps, he thought as he studied the reports of worlds choosing cooperation over conquest, that change might not be entirely unwelcome.
The age of empire was ending. The age of choice had begun.
And, throughout the galaxy, on worlds that had known only subjugation for generations, beings looked up at the stars and whispered a word they had learned from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow sun.
Freedom.